Depending on the situation, meetings can be terrible or they can be blissful. An interview with a potential boss can cause stress. A one-on-one after-school get-together with your principal can cause trepidation. And a follow-up interview with your cancer doctor can cause severe anxiety. Meetings can be dreadful, but they can also be blissful, depending on the situation. For example, a romantic date can cause butterflies. Meeting your child for the first time in the delivery room after they come into this world is unforgettable. And meeting your future spouse at the altar is magical. So meetings can be blissful or can be terrible depending on the situation. What about meeting God? Would that be blissful to you or would it be terrible? This is a good question to ask. And probably you are here because you've asked that question before. A few years ago, I asked my high school class this very question. I asked, what do you feel like to know that you will meet God? And of that class, it's been many years ago, of about 25, 30 students, with the exception of only one, the answer was the same. And they all had the same word: fear. They were afraid to meet God in heaven. What if I said that 3 days from now, God Himself is going to descend from heaven and come to your house and meet with you? Would that have any change of your life between now and Wednesday? Would you go to the grocery store and stock up for meeting God when He came to your house? If so, what would you buy Him? Would you clean your house? Would you get much sleep? Would your stomach be in knots? Would you write down the list of every question I've always wanted to ask God, but I'd be afraid to ask? Now is the time. How would you prepare for that day? And when Wednesday came, 3 days from now, would you wake up that day, if you got any sleep, and would you look at meeting God like Christmas morning or like the Grim Reaper? Well, this is not a hypothetical situation. This actually happened to Israel in Exodus 19, and it has happened and will happen to each one of us in this assembly this morning. We come back to chapter 19, and I began it last week, but the key picture that is etched in our minds from the storyteller is that of a mountain. The storyteller in Exodus magically uses imagery to convey God's presence. Early on, it was the imagery of a bush, both a fiery bush and a bush that Moses holds in a staff to do God's work in the world. Then that changes now to a mountain, where in chapter 19 alone, the term mountain is used by my count 17 times. This is significant. And Israel will never forget meeting God here on Mount Sinai. It will be in their DNA for the rest of their existence. And by the way, if you have Orthodox Jewish friends today, they will still bring it up. And it is here that God meets with His people. And it is significant because for the next year of their lives, Israel will camp at the foot of Sinai to meet with God. And if that is not significant alone, the next 59 chapters of the Old Testament are dedicated to this 1 year that Israel spends with God, which amounts to about 20% of the Pentateuch, is just centered on these 12 months at Sinai. Or to compare it again, we will leave Exodus before Israel leaves the Sinai plain. That's how important this mountain is. And I last week mentioned a favorite example of mine, of the Rocky Mountains with John Denver, who writes a song called Rocky Mountain High. And there is a one line that fits where he says there on the mountain, you can talk to God and listen for his casual reply. And that's exactly what's happening in chapter 19. God is talking to Moses. Moses is talking back to God, and God is listening and then speaking with his casual reply. Now, the mainstay of what's going on in chapter 19, and let me just say this. So, this is just footnote information. This is not the sermon. There are a lot of issues in this chapter where you are going to have unanswered questions. You're going to ask the questions, but they will not be resolved. Let me throw some out to you that I know you're going to ask because I asked them. There are issues of why did God tell Moses to have Israel wash their clothes? And then Moses is to actually ensure that they washed. How is he to do that? We don't get an answer. We don't get an answer of why they're to wash their clothes, or how does Moses oversee the washing of the clothes? Let me give you another one that you will not get an answer to. Why is it that Moses prohibits Israel from having sexual relations with their spouses when God never tells Moses that? Moses takes upon himself to add that here. You can look at it. God will never tell Moses to prohibit Israel from having sexual relations with their spouse, but Moses adds it. Why? We don't know. We do not know a lot of other questions that arise. Where do these priests come from when the priestly office is not inaugurated until the end of Exodus? So where do they come from all of a sudden? We do not know. And I only bring those up because those are not the main point of this passage. That is not what the storyteller is trying to get us to win a Trivial Pursuit contest. What is the main theme is clearly articulated here in the Exodus account. And as I stressed last week, I want to stress again today. It's very important because of the culture we find ourselves in. If you do not understand what's going on in chapter 19, particularly verses 4, 5, and 6, that was the main point. Verses 4, 5, and 6 of chapter 19 is the main central idea that holds 19 and 20 together. If you do not understand what is happening in chapter 19, then you will do what most 20th and 21st century American evangelicals do to the Ten Commandments. You'll moralize it. And the Ten Commandments, as important as they are not the central idea to the Sinai Plain Sermon. Chapter 19, first. The Ten Commandments exist. Exodus 20 exists because chapter 19, verses 4, 5, and 6 exist. And if you have a problem with that, you're going to have a problem with Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount, who completely reapplies the Ten Commandments to those who live in Jesus. Okay, so I want to remain friends here, so you know where I'm going. I'm just saying this because the Ten Commandments today get moral on us in American culture, and that is to our detriment of not understanding original audience and who it's written to. So this all happens in this meeting with God. Okay, now get that out of the way. Back to the sermon. Let me show you from the text you have what is the main theme going on here in the verses we read. It is repeated. Let me start with verse 17. Moses, we're told, if you look at it, brings people out of the camp to do what? Do you see it? To meet with God. That is the main thing going on. God's people are going to the mountain to meet with him. This is further unpacked if you rewind a few verses before to verse 11, where God says, and it's important you see this, the Lord will come down. Do you see it? That is repeated several times in chapter 19. By the way, it's the same word where God looks down from heaven and sees his people in slavery and decides, I will come down to earth and rescue them. The same phrase. So now God will come down to the mountain to meet with his people. And by the way, if you end verse 11, what does it say? In the sight of all the people. So now we don't just have God's people meeting with him, we have God's people meeting with him, verse 17, so that verse 11, they see him. Then, if we add verses 19 and 20 to the mix, Moses was speaking and God was answering him with a voice. This is the John Denver theology. On the mountain, you can talk to God and listen to his casual reply. That's what's going on here. And the Lord came down to Sinai. So now we have mortal man talking to the Almighty and the Almighty listening and talking back. And then the summary to put all this together is in verse 9, where God tells Moses in clear terms, I am going to come down in a dense cloud. And here is the reason. If you look at your text, it should have a that or a so that indicates reason. What is the reason God is coming down from heaven on a mountain in a geographical place to meet with people? So that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so that they will always believe you. This is a refresher of chapter 3, where God tells Moses what to do and why to do it when he goes to Egypt to bring these people back to worship me so that they know you're my man. It's very important the people of Israel know that Moses is God's man, but also so that they hear when I talk to you. So taking all these verses together, what's going on in chapter 19? The people of God are meeting with God on the mountain where they will see him and they will hear him talk. And if you don't think that's significant because this is the first time in the Bible where a collective group of people actually see God come down from heaven on a mountain and hear him talk through Moses and to Moses, and they see the manifestation of his glory. This is the first time in history this happens. And much of what this does is it gives the people of God more than they bargained for when they meet him. So we're back to this scenario. How would you feel if God came to meet you? Because that's what they're going to deal with. Let me quickly give you what happens, and then we'll apply it to us. And I've given it to you in statements of truth. First, we meet with God only on his terms. More of that in a moment, but it's very important that you see that in chapter 19, and particularly that we hear it and know it and believe it in our day where people tend to worship their worship. That we meet God only on his terms, not on ours. The text is divided really between verses 10 through 15 and 15 and the end of the chapter. Verses 10 through 15 is preparing to meet God. There's actually a specific day and time and place God is going to come down. Again, this is all on his terms. We don't get to just waltz into God's presence any way we want, anytime we want. God says, no, in 3 days, I'm going to come to this place and you're going to look this way. And he does the preparation in two ways. One, he puts barriers around the mountain, which is quite ironic, isn't it? that God is coming down near to be with his people. In fact, Paul in Galatians and Dr. Luke in Acts will actually add something to this scene that Exodus does not add. Paul and Dr. Luke will add that angels come with God too. So here we have all of heaven descending on this mountain to meet with mortals, so that these mortals talk with him and they see him. And when this happens, when God comes near, ironically, he says to his people, stay away. I'm coming near, so back off. And he uses this barriers. So for 3 days, police line, do not cross. And if you do, trespassers will be shot on sight. That's literally what they say. If a guy, animal, kid, doesn't matter, if you touch these barriers, you're to be shot through or killed and left there. That's how serious God takes meeting him. So Israel was not to think, God's up on the mountain, last one up's a rotten leg, and I'm going to beat you. No, don't come near me. Don't come near me. There's these barricades. Now, those of you that know me well know that I have a fear of heights. I do not like to be high. And, I'm working on it, but it's still there. And one of the things that make me a nervous wreck is when I have to look straight down at something, okay? And anyone that struggle with that phobia knows what I'm talking about. So and I do things to test me on this. So I'll climb a mountain, for example. We talked about last week in Colorado, there are 58 14ers, mountain ranges that exceed 14,000 feet, and I've been to 5 of them. And I'll test my phobia. And there will be barricades at the edge of a cliff, right? And you get to that. And here's what I will actually test the barricade. Are the bolts properly, a man put this in and it can be discrepant, and so I'll actually test and I even get nervous with other people making fools of themselves. A kid climbs up, look, Mom, no hands. And I'll just walk away because it makes me a nervous wreck. So God puts these boundaries and I don't get near them. And God puts these boundaries around Mount Sinai, and he says, don't even come close. You'll die. Imagine God coming to your house and saying, you have 3 days to prepare. I'm going to use your guest room and shut the door, and you even touch the door handle for 3 days, you're going to drop dead. I mean, Fido, we would hold back. We wouldn't let our cats crawl there. And that's what God is doing to suggest you can't just waltz into my presence any way you want. I'm God, you're not. And we do these things. We understand this distance. There's actually a theological term, okay? So I'm going to give you a theological term. You won't go to hell if you forget this. This is what theologians do. We get terms to try to give concepts. So here's a term for you. I wish I should have put it on the screen, okay? It's a word called transcendence. Now, you're smart enough that you know that transcend. And transcendence is a systematic theological term. And it just simply means the idea of distance. The Latin meaning of transcendence literally means to go beyond. And when theologians talk about transcendence, we mean that God is beyond us and removed from us. And the idea is to express his distance from mortals. He's not touchable. He's not a chum, a buddy. He's in the heavens dwelling, and that's lofty. And so much of church history emphasize God's transcendence. So, for example, in medieval spirituality, and those people, particularly in Europe, you talk about building church buildings to last. It's like, man, they could teach us a thing or two. And they just didn't throw up buildings to look like a shopping mall and call it good. They thought through, what are we trying to convey about God in our worship, even in our architecture? And if you go to church buildings in Europe today, you'll go to some that have these high ceilings. And you think, why do they have high? There's no balconies. There's just high. The idea is to emphasize God is high and beyond and above us. This is why we often will call it high church or high worship. And this is to emphasize God's transcendence, that he is distant and lofty. And that's what he's teaching Israel. You can't just come and have a little Pop-Tart with Jesus. That I'm God for a reason. A few weeks ago, I went to D.C. with several high school students, and I've been to D.C. several times, and it always humbles me, our nation's capital. It's an amazing place. You feel quite proud and quite small. And then you feel really mad that our nation's so jacked up from the way it was founded. It's not an accident. We're great. And we went to the White House. And suppose that President Biden invited me to the Oval Office, to the White House for lunch. I wouldn't pull up in my Camry, pop out on Pennsylvania Avenue, dash the barricades and the fence and start waltzing around the lawn. There's snipers up there. Even though the invitation, I have to go through a series of protocol. We went to the National Holocaust Museum. Has anyone ever been to the National Holocaust Museum? It is an unforgettable experience. And something I know, I've noticed several times in being in the National Holocaust Museum, no one's running around playing Pokemon. No one's yelling. No one's high-fiving. No one's listening to it's a solemn experience. In fact, some girls I was with said, Dr. Albert, I got to get out of here. It's too heavy. The same with Arlington and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. No one has to be told to shut up and pipe down. There's this solemnity to the place. And this is what God is saying to Israel. I'm God, you're not. You can't approach me any way you want to. So don't come near or you'll drop dead. The second is mentioned for us in verses 10 and 14, and that is your Sunday best or nothing else. This is the washing of clothes that is repeated. So they have to prepare to meet God by washing their clothes. Again, a lot of unanswered questions here, but the idea is that we cannot come to God any way we so choose, is what he's teaching Israel here. We don't come to God on our own terms. As the Puritans used to say, you worship God in your way, and we'll worship him in his way. And that means that he chooses, if he doesn't descend to earth, guess what? We're not coming to him. And this brings us to the second truth, that meeting God is an unforgettable experience. This starts in verse 20 now to the end of the chapter. The days of preparation are done. 3 days have elapsed. God comes, and what Israel witnessed that day was one of the most awesome, terrifying displays they never forget. If you ask a typical American evangelical about God, it's, sweet little Jesus, he's a really neat guy, he's my chum. If you talk to Old Testament saints about meeting God, they say, yeah, I wet my pants. Because he's so great and so lofty. And it's an awesome, unforgettable experience, never to be repeated by mortals. If you look at your text, you'll see that all the forces of nature combine. So God now descends on the mountain, and they don't see God fully, because no man can live and see God fully, but they see manifestations of God. They see clouds and smoke, lightning and thunder, fire. The mountain literally shakes, and I think the storyteller is very deliberate. It's the same word. The shaking of the mountain is only matched by the shaking of the Israelite spirit of terror. They both shake. And one can understand that, right? The Israelites are on a plain out in the field at the base of a mountain. They have nowhere to run, no shelter. The place gets dark. Fire, thunder, lightning, smoke, clouds, shaking. And then to top it all off, a ram's horn blast that gets louder and louder as the Almighty descends, and it doesn't let up. So meeting with God is unforgettable. Now let me give you a second theological term, maybe to balance God's transcendence. It's a term called immanence. And here, the Latin simply means to remain in, and it expresses God's nearness to mortals, his closeness, his touchability. And we understand this with the repeated terms, and God came down in a physical place that real people can see and touch and be present. That though God is distant doesn't mean he's unknowable. He actually comes down. And by the way, that must always happen. God must always come down to us for us to know him. And this expresses this other side of God. God does not dwell on Mount Olympus. He doesn't dwell at Mount Sinai. He is in the heavens, but all of heaven come down to earth to speak and to be seen by mortals and to give the people his word. So meeting with God is unforgettable. So unforgettable to the Israelites that this experience here becomes the basis for their architecture of the tabernacle and the temple. Moses will say this later. We are designing the tabernacle and later the temple based upon the Sinai experience, with transcendence seen in the tabernacle and God's immanence seen. So what would happen at the tabernacle? Once a year, God would come down from heaven and descend and meet with mortals and talk with them, and they would see his glory. He would come near, fellowship. But not every mortal could just waltz into that tabernacle. It was divided. And that most holy place, the Holy of Holies, only one priest could go in to represent all mortals and meet with this God. God's transcendence, you see. And that actually is why the tabernacle was built, to remind them of this Sinai experience that they would never forget. Now, as we transition to what does this mean to Calvary Baptist Church? Let me give you one speech that Moses makes to Israel about chapter 19 and about other things. If you would you turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 4? Moses wants to tell the story and remind Israel who could forget our history. And he brings in other things, but he clearly includes Sinai. Chapter 4, verse 32 of Deuteronomy. Indeed, ask about the distant past, starting from the day God created humankind on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other whether there has been such a great thing as this or any rumor of it. So this is what Moses is saying. Has any other generation witnessed what we have witnessed about the greatness of God? That's what he's asking. And the next sentence tells us this. Have a people ever heard the voice of God speaking in the middle of a fire, as you yourselves have and lived to tell about it, i.e. Sinai? God came down to Sinai and he spoke with us and we saw his glory. Has any other people on the face of the earth ever saw this, what you witnessed? It will be unforgettable. You'll never forget this. Or has God ever tried before to deliver a nation in the middle of another nation? That's Egypt and the plagues, accompanied by judgment, signs, wonders, war, strength, and power, and other very terrifying things like the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes. All this happened. The Sinai experience, among other things, happened. Verse 35. So you have been taught that the Lord alone is God. There is none other besides him. My word, he is unforgettable. From heaven he spoke to you in order to teach you, and on earth he showed you his great fire, from which you also heard his words. He is unforgettable. The problem is that Israel forgot about him. So Moses asked this question: have anybody on earth seen anything greater in the manifestation of God than we have? That's what he's asking his contemporaries. And you know how we could answer that? Yes. There has been a people on earth that has seen something greater than Moses and Israel has seen. And I'd like, in the time we have, to now turn our attention to that answer, that I am looking at people who have seen something greater than Moses and Israel has seen, and experienced something that is unforgettable. And you are thought about when the author of Hebrews writes chapter 12. So I'd like you to turn there. And how does Exodus 19 live for Calvary Baptist Church? Because, beloved, if you haven't thought about it yet, and I know many of you have because you've talked to me about it, we are in a time of much confusion about who God is. I don't know if you've ever heard the poem. I think it's titled this, but I'm a man flawed. The title that I remember this poem is Six Blind Men and an Elephant. But I'm sure that's not the title. It is a poem about 6 blind men and an elephant. Some of you could Google and find it. And these blind men, they go up to an elephant to touch it, and they're asked what they're touching. Well, they're blind. So the first blind man goes up to the side of an elephant and touches his body and says, well, I'm touching a wet wall. And the next blind man goes up to the trunk and yanks the trunk and says, well, I'm touching a rope. And the third blind man touches the elephant's ear and says, well, I'm touching a fan. And then it's later revealed you were touching an elephant, and they don't believe it. No, I'm not touching an elephant. I'm touching a wall. I know it's a wall. And they sincerely believe they're touching a wall, rope, fan, whatever. When all the while the elephant himself is talking, which is why it's a fictional poem, right? The elephant is, I'm the elephant. You're touching me. No, I'm not. I'm touching a wall. No, you're touching me. And they won't believe it. They believe their own inclinations and perspectives. And the point is, they're blind. We live in an age where you ask people who God is, and it's their perception of Him. And the Holy Trinity, if you don't know, of America, and particularly American evangelicals, is not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's self-esteem, and it's personal experience, it's sports. That's the God that more Americans worship more than any other. And God is screaming from the Scriptures and creation, and I'm God. No, you're not. No, you're not. You're a wall. No, I'm God. No, you're not. I'm Redeemer. No, you're friend. No, I'm Savior. No, it's not just one way to heaven. And they're trying to tell the elephant he's not an elephant, he's a wall. As Voltaire once said, God made man in His own image, and then man returned the favor. Here we come to Hebrews 12. Now I'll read and give commentary. I want you to start here in verse 18. Now you can start in verse 1, and right out of the gate you'll see scenes of Sinai. And you get a lot of scenes of Sinai. The author says, for you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire, and darkness, and gloom, and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. Well, hold up. Wait. So already out of the gate, we get signs from Sinai. We have clouds, we have smoke, we have fire, we have thunder, we have a voice being heard. And the author of Hebrews has the temerity to tell his readers, you didn't have that personal experience, you had a better one. You had a better one. You don't have to be at Sinai. listening to an audible voice, seeing the earth shake. You actually have a superior one. And he's going to say that as we proceed. For they could not endure the order that was given. And here is straight out of Exodus 19. Even if an animal touches the mountain, it will be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. Now let me stop here. There are a lot of similarities on purpose that the author of Hebrews, he's no slump when it comes to the Old Testament. By my count, he's citing the Old Testament even here about a half a dozen times. And he has a lot of things going on in Hebrews 12 that happens in Exodus 19. God is talking to his people in Exodus 19. God is talking to his people in Hebrews 12. God brings up what happened in Exodus 19 of his presence. Smoke, it starts off even in verse 1. The cloud of witnesses is coming down from heaven to surround God's people. And then we bring up this scenario of Sinai, of smoke, of fire. And so there are a lot of similarities, but there are significant differences. One significant difference is that Exodus 19, the place has changed between there and 12 of Hebrews. In Exodus 19, the people are to meet God in a specific place on earth, Mount Sinai. But here, as we'll read in a moment, God's people do not meet God at Mount Sinai. I hear people say that all the time. I want to go to the Holy Land and be close to God. Really? I'm close to God here in my house. And the author of Hebrews is quite clear, that is inferior to what we have today. That is inferior to what we have today. We do not meet with God at Mount Sinai. We go to Mount Zion. It's quite clear, as we'll read in a moment. Mount Zion, coined by David in the Old Testament, becomes the city of the great king, the dwelling place of God. We are getting ready to meet God in his place. He won't come down to a specific geographical place. We're getting ready to march up to him and meet with him. That's one of the differences. Another significant difference of why we're superior is in Exodus 19, as the author of Hebrews presents here. When the people are met by God on the mountain, their response is fear and trembling. In fact, he brings it up here. But the people of God now, we have the absence of fear. In fact, the command is, you don't fear meeting God anymore. You don't fear that. And there's one and only one answer why we're better, why all this has changed, why we're going to his presence and meeting with him, and why we don't need to fear. And that's the end of Hebrews 12. So let me pick up the end of verse 21 with the fear factor. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear, but you don't. That's the implication. Because you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to the innumerable angels in festival gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enthroned in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Let me skip to the end of verse 24. And to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word, there it is, than the blood of Abel. Now he brings in other Old Testament imagery, and he's saying that the new sprinkling of blood and the new covenant, as he mentions, is better than what Israel had at Sinai and what Abel had and all of them. That's inferior, that's gone, that's old. Well, what is the only answer of why all this is true for us? It's what I skipped over in verse 24, and you know the answer. and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, that's his, that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Do you see what the author is doing here? It's very important that you see it so that your lives act accordingly. On one end, we're prone to extremes when it comes to approaching God. If you are like me, that I have battled in my Christian experience of trying to desperately please God on my own merit. And if you're not careful and you don't understand what Jesus Christ has done for us in bringing us before God where we do not fear, then you'll do, what I did for years. And that is to say, God, I haven't read my Bible enough. I didn't pray like I ought to today. I haven't made my quota of witnessing to people this week. I haven't prayed long enough. I did 10 minutes today, but boy, real saints, they pray for an hour, I know. And if you understand what is happening here, that will liberate you from that performance. That we don't have to have fear of coming into God's presence and pleasing Him because of Jesus anymore. And after all, Jesus is God with us. Emmanuel. John Mason Neal, the author of O Come, Emmanuel, one of our mainstays during Advent season. We sing it every year. It's one of my favorite songs. Did you know that we actually redacted, and I don't mean, I'm not blaming Caitlin or myself here, but there's actually 16 original stanzas. When we redact it because we can't stand here and sing 16 stanzas. Let me share with you one of the stanzas that we do not sing often. And John Mason Neal wrote it after listening to a sermon on Exodus 19 and going to Hebrews 12. So if you have the tune of O Come, Emmanuel in your head, here is the line. I believe this is the original 13th stanza. O come, great Lord of might, who to your tribes on Sinai's height in ancient times did give the law in cloud and majesty and all. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel. Right? So what is John Mason Neal doing? He's saying that Jesus is the Lord of might who has applied, and all of Sinai is fulfilled in him. And when he comes, the great Lord of might, then our Emmanuel has come to us. In her book, Teaching a Stone to Talk, Ann Dillard, and I actually love this book, even though in a moment you'll see she does overreaches. But I'm okay with that, because it is better to tone down a fanatic than raise a corpse. And Ann Dillard, in her book, Teaching Stones to Talk, worries about how the American church has forgot about what it means to worship God, both in His greatness and in His closeness. I'm convinced she wrote this after maybe going to Joel Osteen's church, because this is what she wrote. Does any Christian in this country have the foggiest idea what sort of power from God we invoke in our worship services? Does anyone believe one word of the Bible? Now, that's where I think she's stretching it. If so, then in our worship, it is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet gloves to church when we should all come in wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and should tell us to buckle up in our pews because we are about to meet the living God of the universe. I think I see her point. It is much better than what I think we have, where most people worship their work at their play, and play at their worship. And if you don't believe me, this idea that Jesus is unforgettable, that we must come to God on His terms, like He told Israel in Exodus 19, he still tells us, you cannot worship me any way you want. And to come to God on his terms as Jesus himself fulfills, meaning coming to Jesus. Because you cannot come to the Father but through him. And so to worship God on his terms means you must believe Jesus is the new mediator. That his blood is enough, his death and his resurrection is the greatest experience you'll ever have. And everything else is a downer compared to that, including your and my personal experience, one of the members of the Holy Trinity of Americans. So to come to God on his terms in worship is to come to Jesus. Something at Calvary we try to reinforce with every element in corporate worship. It's Jesus this, Jesus that, Jesus this, Jesus that. Second, coming to Jesus in worship is to come to something unforgettable. And I am convinced that the church and that our church needs to hear this. Last Saturday, you and I participated in this, no doubt, if we love football. And everything I'm about to say, I love football. I love sports. As long as we understand it's a sport, it's a game, okay? People take it far too more serious than it is. Last week, our beloved Kansas City Chiefs played a Saturday night game that became the fourth coldest game in NFL history. There was a lot of preparation for that worship service. And let's be real honest, because I hear people say all the time, I'm more sophisticated than an Israelite to worship a golden calf. Really? We worship a pigskin. And trust me, it is a worship experience because everybody worships something. And if you think about it, those are pretty good worshipers at Arrowhead. I mean, they spend a lot of time preparing for their worship service by painting their face. They are completely unashamed for their gospel because they will yell it and act like fools, particularly when a camera's stuck in their face. And they're pretty good about evangelism. Go up to a perfect stranger at the game, they'll act like they're big chums. They'll get there hours before in no matter what kind of temperature to tailgate. And this really struck a nerve, didn't it? Last week, the coldest gym, there was actually talk around the city of canceling the game because of a public health issue, because it was so cold, relocated and try again, to which we pumped our chest. No, we're Chiefs fans. Hail the Chiefs, we'll do it. We have to worship. And so they prepared. I have some friends that went to the game. By the way, Christian, I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush. They're all pagan. Christian friends who went to the game have every right to do so, and they prepared for it. They went out and bought ski clothes, ski glasses. They wore 4 layers of clothes. They even went and brought a carpet remnant to the game so they could place it on the concrete floor to absorb the cold while they stood out there and cheered. They went to tailgate for 2-3 hours before the game, another 3 hours with the game and celebration after the game in sub-zero temperatures. And we learned this week that 6 people were admitted to area hospitals because of all sorts of reactions to the cold. Hypothermia and other frostbite conditions. In fact, I read a report, I have not confirmed it, so I might be right. I read a report on Friday that 3 men that went to the game went back partying some more of the victory, went outside, passed out because they partied too much, and died in the cold because they passed out. If that's true, they literally gave their lives for their God and their worship. Now, I'm having a little bit of fun. I don't believe you're a pagan if you go to a Chiefs game. Go Chiefs. Although one wonders today if that will be true. But anyway. What struck me as ironic after this game is within just a few hours after it, A local church that I know the pastor to this church, good man, canceled their Sunday morning service and sent out a report, because it's cold, we're canceling our Sunday morning service. Be safe out there. And I know for a fact, because I know this church, that some of his parishioners just came home from the game. And I thought, hold up. We had a week to prepare for these sub-zero temperatures. People act like a bunch of banshees out there. Some guys out there were without shirts chanting. And here you have the most unforgettable message in the world. And last I checked, you're not going to meet outside. You're going to meet in nice, comfort-controlled climate. You're not going to charge anybody for admission. You're going to give them the greatest news in the world. And let's face it, the Chiefs will be forgot about in time. It may take centuries, but everyone's going to forget about that cold game. No one is ever going to forget about Jesus. So that, and you'll have to excuse my drama here, that is a good juxtaposition of where we're at and the mindset people are at. Jesus, but everybody worships something. And we do what we love to do. I'll close with another line from a hymn by John Newton, who wrote, by my count, over 500 hymns. It's an obscure one. It's called Praise for Redeeming Love. Here John Newton draws upon Exodus 19 and Hebrews 12. And I commend this for you, Calvary. Let us love and sing and wonder. Let us praise the Savior's name. He has hushed the law's loud thunder. He has quenched Mount Sinai's flame. Because he has washed us with his blood, he has brought us near to God. Praise his name. Our Father, I thank you for your assembly here. And I pray that we would go renewed in the fact that we are brought near by a God that is so great, that has come into our very lives because of sweet Jesus. We have nothing to fear by coming into your presence. In fact, Jesus is much greater than any event at Sinai, in creation, in Egypt. He is our everything. He is the culmination of history. And we come to you, Father, through him, and we come for him, and we shall never forget about him because of who he is and what he's done. This I pray in the sweet name of Jesus our Lord. Amen.